The morning Sloane found out she was pregnant, she was standing in the bathroom of the condo. She and her husband had spent 3 years paying down together, holding a test strip under the fluorescent light like it might change its mind. 2 lines. She sat down on the edge of the tub and stayed there for a long time, listening to the sound of Mitchell getting ready in the other room. The shower running, the drawer opening and closing, the particular way he hummed when he was in a good mood. She wanted to go out there and tell him. She had her hand on the doorknob twice, but something made her stop. That same low hum in her chest that she'd been ignoring for months. The kind of feeling you push down because you don't want to be the kind of woman who has it. She put the test in her coat pocket and went to work. Sloane had been the youngest senior project manager at Norman Vale Architecture in the firm's 31-year history. Her boss, a serious man named Douglas with wire-rimmed glasses and a handshake that meant business, had told her that in the same tone he used to announce quarterly figures, like it was a fact that belonged to a spreadsheet, not to her. She'd called her mom that evening, and her mom had cried a little, the quiet kind, and said, "That's my girl." She was 32 years old. She had rebuilt the kitchen of their condo herself on weekends. She drove a sensible car, kept a garden on the balcony that actually survived winter, and made the best butter chicken anyone in her office had ever tasted for the annual potluck. She was, by every available measure, doing fine. And she loved Mitchell. She had loved him since she was 26, and he walked into the same dinner party carrying a bottle of wine he clearly hadn't known how to choose. He'd admitted that to her by the end of the night. I just pointed at something that looked serious, and she'd laughed harder than she had in months. That was the thing about Mitchell. He made her laugh. He had a warmth to him that made rooms feel smaller in the good way. She told herself the feeling in her chest was anxiety. New project, high stakes, long hours. That was all. She did not let herself think about the phone calls he took in the car. The Saturday mornings he came home from the gym, looking freshly showered, when she knew the gym showers were broken, and had been for weeks. The way he'd started setting his phone face down on the table, every single time, like it was a habit he'd always had. She told herself a lot of things that year. She was 14 weeks along when she went to the clinic for her first proper ultrasound. Mitchell had said he'd meet her there. He had a client call that morning. "You know how Gerald is, he'll go sideways if I cancel." But he'd be there by 11, he promised. He kissed her on the forehead and she drove herself. She lay on the table with the cold gel on her stomach and watched the screen. The technician was a kind woman named Britt who pointed things out gently. "There's the heartbeat, see that flutter?" And Sloane felt something open up in her chest that she hadn't expected. A door she hadn't known was closed. She took the printed image with both hands. Mitchell wasn't there at 11. He wasn't there at 11:30. She texted him and waited in the lobby with the photo in her lap, watching the sliding doors. A woman came through with a newborn in a carrier and smiled at Sloane the way pregnant women and new mothers sometimes smile at each other, this sideways recognition. He called at 12:15. "Babe, I'm so sorry Gerald ran long. Can we look at the picture tonight?" She said sure. She said it was fine. She drove home on autopilot and almost missed her exit. The firm had given her a new project in February, a mixed-use development in the East End that was easily the largest contract she'd managed on her own. She'd been working 12-hour days. She'd been living on coffee and the peanut butter crackers she kept in her desk drawer. She was tired in the particular way that pregnancy makes you tired, which is different from regular tired because it sits inside you, rather than on top of you. It was during this stretch that she started noticing a name, not because it appeared anywhere she expected, but because of what happened to Mitchell's posture when his phone went off. The way he'd glance at the screen and then set it face down, just a half-second too quickly. Once, she walked into the room while he was on a call, and he switched to short answers immediately. Yeah, I know, we'll talk later," the kind of truncated language people use when someone else has walked in. She didn't snoop. She wanted to be clear about that, even now, even in the retelling. She wasn't someone who went through phones. She genuinely believed, that if you had to check, you'd already answered your own question, and she wasn't ready to answer it. But one evening she picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd left it. She was going to hang it up, that's all, and his phone slid out of the pocket and landed face up on the hardwood floor. The screen lit. A message preview. A name she didn't recognize. Still thinking about last night. "Miss you already." Sloane stood in the hallway for a long time. Then she hung up his jacket, went to the kitchen, and made dinner. She didn't say anything for 2 weeks. She knows how that sounds. She's thought about it enough times to have lost count. But the thing about carrying a secret that belongs to someone else, is that you spend a lot of time calculating what you can afford. She was 15 weeks pregnant. She was in the middle of the biggest project of her career. She had a mortgage and a condo, and a kitchen she'd built with her own hands. She was not ready to blow it all up on a phone screen she'd seen for half a second. So she watched, and the more she watched, the more she understood that this had not just started. Whatever this was, it had been going on long enough to have its own gravity. Long enough that Mitchell had stopped being careful, which meant he'd stopped thinking he needed to be. He came home late 3 Tuesdays in a row. He started running, Mitchell, who had never run voluntarily in the 4 years she'd known him, and he'd come back from these runs looking energized in a way that had nothing to do with exercise. He bought new cologne. He looked at her sometimes across the kitchen with an expression she couldn't quite read, something halfway between guilt and relief, like she was a problem he hadn't yet decided how to solve. She called her best friend Petra. No, wait, not Petra. Her friend's name was Anwen. She called Anwen on a Saturday afternoon while Mitchell was out running, and she sat cross-legged on the balcony in the cold with her coat pulled around her stomach and said, quietly, "I think he's seeing someone." Anwen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" And Sloane said, "I don't know." "A while." And Anwen said, "What are you going to do?" And Sloane looked out at the city and said, "I don't know that either." She found out who it was on a Thursday. Not intentionally. Or at least, not entirely. She had an early meeting downtown and finished ahead of schedule, so she stopped at the café near their condo, the one with the good cappuccino and the pastries Mitchell always said were overpriced. She ordered a tea because she'd cut back on caffeine. She found a seat by the window. They were at a table in the back corner. Mitchell and a woman Sloane didn't recognize. The woman was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on the table close to his. She was beautiful in the uncomplicated way of someone who doesn't think about whether she is. Dark hair, a red coat, a way of leaning forward when she spoke like the whole world narrowed to whoever was in front of her. Mitchell reached across and covered her hand with his. Sloane did not move. She sat completely still with her tea cooling in her hands and watched her husband touch another woman the way you touch someone when you mean it. The woman glanced up at one point and their eyes almost met. Sloane looked down at her cup. She left before either of them saw her. She walked 3 blocks in the wrong direction before she realized where she was going. Then she sat down on a bench on a street she'd never particularly noticed and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the kind of crying that comes when something you've been holding finally lets go. She was 16 weeks pregnant. She was cold. She called Anwen again and said, "I saw them." She confronted Mitchell that night. She'd spent the afternoon deciding how to do it, calmly, clearly, without yelling, with receipts. And then he came home and put his keys on the counter and smiled at her like he always did, and everything she'd planned dissolved. She said, "I saw you today, at the cafe on Merchant Street." She watched his face go very still. He said, "Sloane." She said, "Don't." And then she said, "Are you in love with her?" He was quiet for a long time. That quiet was its own answer, and she knew it, and she could see that he knew she knew. And he said, "It's not, it's complicated. I didn't plan for this." She said, "I'm pregnant, Mitchell." He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he'd been trying not to learn. She said, 16 weeks, in case you forgot, in case you were too busy to notice. He said he knew. He said he hadn't forgotten. He said things that sounded like apology and weren't. He used words like confused and wasn't trying to hurt you and I don't know what I want, and she stood in her own kitchen listening to him and felt something shift inside her. Not breaking, not falling. Something more like the moment before a door closes. Definite. Quiet. She said, "Get out." He said, "Sloane, let's talk about this." She said, "Get out of my house." He left. He took a bag. He texted her an hour later, saying he was at his brother's place, if she needed anything. She did not respond. The weeks that followed were the hardest she'd had, since her dad had his heart attack 5 years ago, and she'd driven through the night to get to Ottawa. Except this time there was no emergency room, no bright hallway, no clear thing to do. There was just the condo, and her project, and her body slowly building a person she hadn't entirely planned for, and the absence of Mitchell's things from the bathroom counter. Her mom drove down from Kingston the first weekend and didn't say "told you so," even though Sloane suspected she had, at some point, thought it. Instead, her mom cooked soup and sat on the couch with her and watched 3 episodes of a cooking competition show and held Sloane's hand during the sad parts. Her dad called the morning after and said, "You are the toughest person I know, and that baby is going to be so lucky." She cried on the phone for a while and then felt better. Work was, surprisingly, a lifeline. She threw herself into the Eastgate project with the kind of focus that only comes when the alternative is too quiet. Her team was good. particularly a structural consultant named Rafferty, who had been on 3 of her previous projects and had a talent for cutting through complications with minimal drama. He was pragmatic, a little dry, someone you could trust to tell you when something wasn't going to work. He noticed, of course. The people who work closely with you always do. He didn't say anything for a while. He just made sure there was always a chair pulled out when she got to a meeting first, and he started scheduling the longer site visits for mornings instead of afternoons without explaining why. She appreciated it without saying so. One evening, working late in the boardroom with site plans spread across the table, he looked up from a set of drawings and said, "You don't have to do this alone, you know, all of this." She looked at him. He said, "I mean the project. I have capacity right now if you want to redistribute some of the load." She said, "Right. The project." He held her gaze for just a beat longer than necessary, then looked back at the drawings. She went home that night and thought about it for longer than she wanted to admit. Mitchell reached out 3 weeks after he left. He wanted to talk. He was staying at his brother Caleb's place in Barrie, and he'd had a lot of time to think, and he believed they could work through this, that what they had was worth fighting for, that he'd made mistakes. Real mistakes, Sloane. I know that. But that he loved her. He still loved her. She agreed to meet him, not because she was considering taking him back. She was clear enough on that. But because there was a baby involved, and she wasn't the kind of person who made irrevocable decisions without a conversation. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of them lived in. She got there first and ordered a decaf and picked a table with her back to the wall, the way her dad always sat in restaurants. Mitchell looked tired. Not a flattering tired, not the tired of someone who'd been suffering beautifully. Just the ordinary tired of a person who'd created a mess and had been living in it. He talked for a long time. She let him. She watched the way he used his hands when he was nervous, the way he'd always done, and she remembered loving that about him, and then she felt sad in a way that had nothing to do with anger. When he was finished, she said, "Mitchell, are you still seeing her?" He looked down at his coffee. She said, "That's fine, I just need to know." He said, "I don't know what it is. I don't want to lose either of you." She said very quietly, "Then you should have thought about that a long time ago." She drove home, and on the way she made 3 decisions. She was keeping the baby. She was not taking Mitchell back. And she was going to be fine, not eventually, not in a year, not after it got easier. She was going to be fine in the actual present tense sense, starting now, starting with the drive home. She put on the radio. She sang along to something she didn't know very well. It helped, a little. The thing about Rafferty was that he didn't try to be something he wasn't. She'd worked with men who became very attentive when a woman was in a difficult situation, and there was a quality to that attention that was more about proximity than care, hovering, performing concern in a way that made you feel like a project. Rafferty wasn't like that. He was the same on bad days and good ones. He asked about the Eastgate site drainage issues with the same directness he asked how she was feeling, and he didn't linger on either. They started having lunch together sometimes. Not every day, not formally, just. He'd appear in the doorway of her office at noon with his jacket on and say, "I'm going to that Thai place on King, do you want to come?" And she'd say yes or she'd say no, and either was fine. She said yes more often as winter turned. She learned things about him over soup and Pad CU. He'd grown up in Fredericton, moved to Toronto for school, ended up in the city by way of a project that ran 2 years longer than expected, and then a lease that was cheaper than he'd planned to leave. He had a sister in Vancouver he called every Sunday. He read actual books, physical ones, which she found quietly endearing. He had opinions about transit that she agreed with 50% of, and argued the other 50 with genuine interest. He was funny in the way that good engineers sometimes are, precise, a little unexpected, arriving at the punchline sideways. She liked him. She'd liked him for a while, she realized, without having given it a name. She was 7 months pregnant, and the baby had started doing this thing where she kicked every time. Sloane listened to anything with a strong bass line, which was both inconvenient and delightful. When Mitchell texted to say that the woman, her name was Breeza, was also pregnant. Sloane read the text twice. She put her phone face down on the desk. She sat with it for a while. Then she picked the phone back up and called Anwin and said, "You are not going to believe this." And Anwin said, "I might." And Sloane said, "She's pregnant." And Anwin said a word that Sloane would not repeat in polite company, but that was exactly the right word for the situation. She felt surprisingly less devastated than she might have expected. She felt, and she said this to Anwin, testing whether it was true as she said it, more like someone who has just been given very clear evidence that a decision they already made was the right one. It was one thing to know that Mitchell had fallen for someone else. It was another kind of knowing to understand that he had built a whole separate life with her, quietly in parallel, while Sloane had been building her kitchen and managing her project and getting through her days. She said, "I think I'm okay." Anwen said, "You sure?" She said, "I think so." Yeah, she told Rafferty the next day, not intending to, just because he was there and she was tired of carrying things alone. They were on site, the two of them and two contractors, walking through the ground-level retail space that was still concrete and framing. She was in her hard hat and her large-format pregnancy coat that she hated but wore because it was practical, and he was walking beside her with his tablet, and she just said it. While they were looking at a wall, "Mitchell's other woman is pregnant too." He stopped walking. The contractors moved ahead. He said, "Sloane," she said, "I know. It's a lot." He said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I actually think I am," weirdly. He looked at her for a long moment. He had that quality she'd noticed before, of not filling silence with noise just because the silence was there. He said, "You're the most self-possessed person I've ever worked with. You know that?" She said, "Don't let it get around. I have a reputation for being approachable." He laughed. She laughed. It bounced off the concrete walls. She thought, there it is. That particular thing that had been sitting in her chest unnamed. It had a shape now. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed it, the way you notice when a window has been opened in a room that's been closed all winter. Her daughter was born on a Tuesday in late April, just after 7 in the morning, during a light rain that turned to sun by 9. She was 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and she had a serious expression on her face that made the delivery nurse laugh and say that one knows exactly what she thinks. Her name was Rosalie. Sloane had decided this on the drive to the hospital, suddenly, with the certainty of someone receiving information rather than making a choice. Her mom was there. Anwen was in the waiting room. Her dad drove 5 hours through the night and arrived just as visiting hours started and held Rosalie with the careful enormity of a man who understood what he was holding. Mitchell came to the hospital that afternoon. She'd told him he could. He was pale and quiet and held Rosalie for a few minutes with great care, and Sloane watched him and felt something that she wouldn't have predicted, something almost gentle. Not forgiveness exactly. More like the recognition that a person can be genuinely terrible for you and also genuinely human, and both of those things can be true at once. He left after an hour. He texted her that evening, "She's beautiful. Thank you for letting me come." She sent back a simple of course. She was back at work in 3 months, which her mom thought was too soon, and her dad called very Sloane. She brought Rosalie to the office on Fridays sometimes because the firm had a nursing room now. One of the things she'd quietly advocated for, and her team took turns holding the baby between meetings with a reverence that she found quietly amusing. Rafferty was the same. This was the thing about him. He was always the same. He came to her office one Friday afternoon when Rosalie was asleep in the carrier on Sloane's chest, and Sloane was reviewing elevations with one hand and eating a sandwich with the other. He stood in the doorway and she looked up and he said, "I was thinking of asking you to dinner. Not a working dinner. A dinner. She said, "That sentence has a lot of dinners in it." He said, "I know. I've been drafting it for a while." She looked at him. Rosalie made a small sound and settled. She said, "It would have to be somewhere with a good ramp. The stroller's a beast." He said, "I know a place." She said, "Okay then." He smiled. Not a big smile, not a performance, just the real kind, and said, "Okay then." They took it slowly. There was no version of this that went quickly, and neither of them wanted it to. Sloane had a daughter and a job, and a condo she'd spent 3 years building into something she loved. Rafferty had, as he put it, enough sense to know when something's worth not rushing. They had dinner. They had more dinners. He pushed the stroller on Sunday mornings while she drank her coffee with both hands, which was a luxury she had not fully appreciated until she didn't have it. He was good with Rosalie in the way of someone who was paying attention rather than performing. Not cooing or talking in a high voice, just present, genuinely interested in this small new person who had arrived in the world with opinions. Rosalie regarded him with the serious expression she'd had since birth, and eventually, after several weeks, smiled at him first. He accepted this as the significant honor it was. Sloane's mom called after meeting him for the first time. "He's very steady." She said yes. Her mom said, "I like steady." She said, "Me too." The Eastgate project opened on a gray November morning, 2 years after Sloane had first sent a plan. There was a small event. Douglas gave a speech. The developer shook hands with everyone. There were photos for the firm's website. Sloane stood in the atrium she'd helped design, with its light-filled upper floors and its double-height retail windows and its structural ingenuity that only people who knew what to look for would ever notice, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not pride, exactly, or not just pride. More like the particular satisfaction of having done something real while everything else was coming apart. Like the building was also a record of who she'd been during those years. The decisions she'd made at midnight, the weeks she'd cried in her car, the Tuesday she'd sat on a bench in the cold and let herself fall apart and then gotten up. Rafferty found her in the atrium after the crowd had thinned. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood next to her and looked up at the light coming through the upper windows. He said, "You built something good here," she said. "We did." He took her hand. She let him. Outside, the gray had lifted. The sun was doing that thing it does in November in Ontario, low and golden and more beautiful for being temporary, and Sloane stood in the building she'd made and held the hand of someone who had stayed, and thought about her daughter at home with her mom, and thought about her dad calling this morning just to say he was proud of her, and felt, finally, solidly, without qualification, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.